Who Speaks for Islam? Next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage, Assistant Director of the Institute of World Affairs at UWM. U.S. involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan has led many Americans to imagine the boundaries of the Islamic world as being largely defined by the map of the Middle East. The reality is strikingly different. Nearly a quarter of the world's population is Muslim, with followers of the faith distributed across the globe. Germany is home to more Muslims than Lebanon, and the East Asian nation of Indonesia has the world's largest Muslim population. Not surprisingly, these 1.5 billion people hold a diverse array of worldviews and opinions, many of which are rarely reflected in Western media. To help give voice to the Muslim world's silent majority, the Gallup polling organization undertook a massive multi-year study, conducting tens of thousands of interviews in more than 35 nations that are predominantly Muslim or have significant Muslim populations. We're pleased to be joined today by the lead analyst of that study. Dalia Mogahed is Executive Director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies. She also directs the Muslim West Facts Initiative, which disseminates the findings of Gallup polling to key opinion leaders in the Muslim world and the West. Her work has been featured in leading international publications, including The Economist, The Financial Times, The Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Policy Magazine. Dalia Mogahed, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, I wonder if we could start with sort of the thinking within the Gallup organization that really led to this study. I mean, certainly it was not something to be taken lightly. I assume there was a lot of discussion that led up to it.
Well, the story is really an interesting one. Shortly after 9/11, our CEO, Jim Clifton, was watching a press conference with Donald Rumsfeld, where a reporter asked him, "What do Muslims around the world think about these attacks?" And his response was, "Well, I don't know. It's not like you can take a Gallup poll." And it was that comment that really sparked the idea and indeed the need for this massive study. Our CEO, along with our executive team, realized that our leaders needed to understand what was on the minds of people around the world. And without it, they were making decisions really into a black box.
Well, and I think leading up to that, there was this notion of perhaps an inevitable clash of civilizations, and probably one of the most notable proponents of that theory, Samuel Huntington, in a foreign affairs piece, really posited that now conflict will not be about ideology; it'll be about these sort of deeper issues. Mm-hmm. I'd like to just read you a quote from that article and get your reaction, sort of as the study informed.
Sure.
The differences among civilizations are not only real, they're basic. Civilizations are differentiated from each other by history, language, culture, tradition, and most important, religion. The people of different civilizations have different views on the relations between God and man, the individual and the group, the citizen and the state, parents and children, husband and wife, as well as differing views of the relative importance of rights and responsibilities, liberty and authority, equality and hierarchy. These differences are the product of centuries. They will not soon disappear.
Well, it's a very interesting point of view. It certainly oversimplifies things a little bit. One thing it ignores is that when you actually look at the data, when you actually look at empirical evidence, people across the world share much in common. And in fact, what I think is most interesting is that the most basic assumption of the clash of civilization theory is that especially Muslim societies don't understand and certainly don't value democracy, that democratic values and principles are just simply not shared across communities. And that's what we found to be one of the most surprising and perhaps counterintuitive discoveries. We asked Muslims around the world what they admired most about the West. And the two most frequent responses were technology and second, liberty and democracy. In fact, the two things that Dr. Huntington claims are what Muslims around the world resent the most or are most different from us.
Well, and I would think there's a certain suggestion of a monolithic nature of civilizations, and I assume that's hardly what you found.
Well, it's absolutely true. There is no monolithic Muslim world, just like there's no monolithic West. I think that there's, the clash theory makes two mistakes. It does assume a monolithic Muslim community, and it also assumes a monolithic West, and both are really very untrue. People in the Bible Belt don't think the same as people in France. People in France are different from one another. And same is the case across Muslim communities around the world. Some Muslims live in vibrant democracies. Others live in autocratic regimes. There is so much difference in language, in ethnicity, in opinion across the world.
Well, before we get to some of your findings, why don't you talk a little bit about the methodology? I mean, 35 nations, multi-year, that seems like quite an undertaking.
It really was. We wanted to give the world the silenced majority. We wanted to give them a voice, to make them be heard by those in power and by the public, just as we've been doing for 70 years at Gallup. So what we did is we went into more than 35 countries and conducted face-to-face in-home interviews that lasted at least an hour. And we chose our sample to represent the population as a whole. So we talked to young people and old people, to rich people, poor people, to very educated people, as well as illiterate people, of course, to men and to women, people in cities, people in the country, so that we covered the entire country and could actually give a projection of what the nation as a whole thought.
And what was the reaction of some of the governments in those countries? I mean, were they in some cases suspicious of what you might be up to? Or?
Sure. In some cases they were. And we always tried to be very respectful of local authorities. We would, in many countries, have to get permission to do our polling. And we do that especially to keep our vendors and the interviewers safe, so that they're not harassed by local law enforcement and or sometimes even arrested. So we would always go through the proper channels to get our interviews, our questionnaires approved, and then give people the opportunity to go all over the country. Without that approval, other polling institutions can only go to very big cities, which of course don't reflect the whole country.
Sure. And who did the actual polling?
The actual polling is done by local firms that we train and supervise, and of course use the questionnaires that we train them on, but it's done in local languages by local people, and that way people can have a comfortable conversation with a peer.
Sure. And what were the responses, not in terms of to the questions, but just to the idea of the poll among the people that you spoke with?
Well, the funny thing is that the hardest thing we sometimes had was having people let us leave their homes. People were so gracious and welcoming and felt so inspired and excited to have someone ask them their opinion. It's something that they weren't used to in many cases. And all over the world, whether we were in Latin America or Africa or the Middle East, people were really grateful. They thanked us for conducting such a project to give ordinary people a voice.
And a little earlier you used the term silenced majority rather than silent. What does that imply? Who's silenced them?
Well, they're silenced by so many different factors. They're silenced by vocal extremists who are trying to monopolize the conversation. They're silenced by often media that isn't interested in ordinary people and only features sensational news items that often ignore the common man. They're also in many cases silenced by local governments that don't allow them to speak. So in so many ways, the majority isn't silent. They're trying to speak, they're trying to communicate, they're trying to get their views across, but that they are indeed silenced. And this is a way, a scholarly tool, to give them a voice and therefore let the majority speak for itself.
Well, we spoke a little bit about just the diversity within the Muslim world and how that's not often adequately appreciated here. Do you think within the Muslim world, the people you spoke to had some sense of that diversity, and have some of the new media changed that over the last decades?
That's a really interesting question. In some cases they did, and in some cases they didn't. And just like many Americans say they don't know much about Muslims, many Muslims around the world also don't know much about America or Americans. And so while some of them are very educated and know a great deal about us, some don't. And it really just varied across educational levels. But yes, with new media, young people especially were very tuned in and often read the same books as young people here, listen to the same music. There's several connections because of new media. And
I think both familiarity with the Muslim West kind of dynamic, but also within the Muslim world, wouldn't you say? I mean, there's now a greater sense of being some sort of contiguous entity that perhaps wasn't there before.
In some cases that's the case. In some cases it's still around the nation state. It really just depends. I think it's an interesting thing to keep tracking. I think that with the growth of satellite television as well as the internet, people do get a greater sense of a global community than they did perhaps 50 years ago. But even today, many people still look at the world within the prism of a nation state.
Well, we've got just about a minute before our break, but were there sort of broad categories of questions? And then after the break, perhaps we can delve into some of the findings.
We had questions that just looked at people's everyday lives and their satisfaction with their schools, their water, things you would ask all over the world. We also asked questions around governance, gender, peace and security, as well as Muslim-West relations.
And was there any sort of pressure by any of the countries in which you were doing your work to stay away from certain topics?
Well, in some countries, a limited number, some of our questions were simply cut from our questionnaire. We weren't allowed to ask them if we wanted to poll in that country, and that's something we had to deal with and had to work around in many cases by asking open-ended questions or asking the same topic but in a different way.
Well, that's great. And after our break, I'd like to delve into some of those responses and what you uncovered. To our viewers, we'll be back in just a moment with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking with Dalia Mogahed, lead analyst of a multi-year Gallup study on opinions in the Muslim world. So we talked a little bit about the methodology and how the study was put together. Now I'd like to talk a little bit more about what your findings were. Is there anything that was counterintuitive?
I think that the most important thing we came away with, and we discovered many things that were surprising and counterintuitive, but the most significant was that this conflict between Muslim communities around the world and the United States or the West more broadly was not inevitable, because unlike what Samuel Huntington claims, it was not about principles but about policy and politics. And therefore, it wasn't an inherent conflict. It was a temporary conflict. I think that was the most important finding. We also found that unless we start to understand the root cause of what was going on and listen directly to ordinary people, the fear is that extremists on both sides could continue to gain ground.
So, you mentioned sort of the common values, and what's something the sort of American talk radio listener might be surprised about in terms, you mentioned, for example, democracy being something that was very much admired. And anything else?
Well, there were several things about governance that I think that were very similar. Both communities, Americans as well as Muslims around the world, saw religious principles as playing a role in governance. So many people might be surprised to find out that in America, a majority of Americans say that they think the Bible should be a source of legislation. 9% think it should be the only source. And similarly, religious Muslim principles are also seen by many Muslims as needing to play a role in legislation. So I think that was an interesting commonality that we may have not expected. We also found that both communities were deeply concerned about terrorism. And I think that surprises many people. In fact, Muslim communities around the world were slightly more likely than Americans to say that they were themselves afraid of being victims of terrorism, that it was something that they felt was something that they needed to be addressed to improve relations with the West. That they were more likely, in fact, to say that than Americans were when talking about what the Muslim world should do to improve relations with the West. So I think that was an interesting area of common ground. Is both or all communities were very against terrorism, and in fact felt that it was a personal threat to themselves. The final thing that I thought was very interesting in terms of common ground was family. That Americans feel that family is a very important value. That's not something that everyone around the world agrees on. Some people put a lot of things before that, but that was something that there was common ground on as well.
So the issue of terrorism, one of the things that people in this country have often criticized sort of this imagined Muslim world for is not condemning terrorism more forcefully. And is it the fact that we're just not listening, or has there been little condemnation?
I think that the facts are that there's been tremendous condemnation, and it's been widespread and basically unanimous. So shortly after 9/11, with to my knowledge, no exception, every major Muslim leader and organization issued a formal condemnation in the strongest terms of the terrorist attack. I think the other piece that needs to be understood, though, is that Muslims themselves are afraid of terrorism. In fact, they're more concerned about it than we are at this point. And it's no wonder why. They're the primary victims of terrorism. Just look at the facts. The vast majority of victims of terrorist acts around the world or committed by a Muslim are Muslims. And so if we just think about that for a minute, it becomes it makes less and less sense for us to demand that people condemn something that they themselves are actually its primary victim. I think we should assume that they disagree with it simply because we are much less likely than they are to be harmed by it.
Well, and I'm wondering, within the study, did you see differences geographically? I mean, were there commonalities within geographical groups?
In some cases there were some broad commonalities. For example, Asian Muslims, especially those in Indonesia and Malaysia, had very high percentages that supported free speech, freedom of religion. It's a very pluralistic society, and freedom of assembly. Now, majorities in the Middle East also supported these three freedoms, especially freedom of speech, but were less strong, although still majorities, to support freedom of religion and freedom of assembly. And so experiencing a pluralistic society does seem to increase one's understanding and appreciation for those freedoms. We also found that sub-Saharan African Muslims were by far the most likely to express pro-American views. In fact, they expressed more pro-American views in 2008 than did our closest Western allies in Western Europe. And so it's interesting to note that the most pro-American people in the world are actually Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa, and the most anti-American people in the world actually happen to be Western Europeans and not Middle Easterners, which is sort of a surprise.
Well, how has the study been received here? I mean, I think one of the issues it creates immediately is it's a much more complex reality that we have to deal with, and we have to try to mediate that reality through what are often very simplistic instruments of the media. So it's much easier to say Muslims think this.
Right.
When we have these shades and nuances, it's a lot more difficult. So
it is more difficult, but I think it's also more interesting and in many cases much more hopeful, just to get the views of ordinary people and almost have a global conversation between ordinary Americans and ordinary citizens of countries around the world who may never meet but get to exchange views through this tool. And so we've really been received, the study has been received overwhelmingly positively by government officials, by media, especially international media, but also U.S. media, and by the general public. I've traveled the world and the United States speaking to diverse publics, and it's always been, with very little exception, a very positive experience of people just glad that they finally have the facts, that they don't have to listen to competing dogma anymore.
Do you find any resistance to what could threaten a very simplistic worldview?
Certainly. I mean, there's always going to be some resistance, especially people who benefit in some way from the simplistic worldview, either through their fundraising efforts are kind of fueled by fear. This kind of a study gets in the way of that. But for the most part, with those as the exception, and they are very small in number, people are just so glad to get numbers, concrete science and empirical evidence around what has been for much of our history and our dealing with this issue an emotional and confusing topic. And I really think that this is something that Americans, as a community, we have in common, that we really look to wanting to know the facts. We're interested in learning new things, and we adapt when we learn new facts. And so there's really a hunger for this kind of information.
Well, and I know this is not all you do, certainly, and you have an ongoing challenge in sharing polling data, both with Muslim leaders and leaders elsewhere. Could you tell us a little bit about that work?
Sure. In partnership with the Coexist Foundation, Gallup is disseminating the findings of our independent research to opinion leaders around the world. And so we've been doing this for 3 years now and have touched thousands of opinion leaders from Madeleine Albright to the Grand Mufti of Egypt, all really a global effort. It's very interesting to go through this process because we talk to such diverse groups, from geographically diverse, in terms of their political ideology, very diverse, but with almost no exception, when we lay out the methodology, when we lay out the facts, the response is always, there's just a huge misunderstanding. And I think that that's been very interesting and a very rewarding effort to really go on, because we're not proposing any specific policy. We're not advocating for any point of view. We're simply educating and allowing leaders to make good decisions by being well informed.
And wasn't that, if memory serves, sort of the underlying origins of Mr. Gallup's creating the company?
Absolutely, exactly. He really, his philosophy and his mission was that leaders make better decisions when they are informed by the will of the people. And so he said someone needs to go find out what that will is, and that's what he built his company around.
Well, Dalia Mogahed, it's certainly an impressive effort to do just that, and I'm sure we'll be looking at this data for some time to come and look forward to your new activities as well.
Thank you very
To our
much.
viewers, we will look forward to seeing you back here on International Focus next time.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,